Nkemdalai came back to her father's village with a heavy heart after his death. She had always been close to him, and the farmland he left behind was more than just land. It was a piece of his soul. She remembered how he used to say, "This soil will always feed you, my daughter." But when she arrived, the peace she hoped for quickly turned into pain. Her uncle, Izu, had already taken over the farmland. He looked her straight in the eyes and said, "You are just a woman, you have no right here." His words cut deep, but Nkemdalai stood her ground. She tried to explain that her father wanted her to continue his work, but no one listened. At the family meeting, everyone laughed when she spoke about her claim. The elders mocked her, calling her foolish for thinking a woman could own land. Days passed, and Nkemdalai stayed in her late father's house, heartbroken but not defeated. While cleaning his study one evening, she found an old brown envelope hidden behind some books. Her father's signature was on it, along with a government stamp. Her hands trembled as she opened it. It was an official land ownership document with her name written clearly. Her father had already registered the farmland in her name before he died. Tears filled her eyes. It felt like he was still protecting her, even from the grave. When Uncle Izu learned that Nkemdalai had found something, he grew nervous. He tried to convince the village elders that she forged the papers, even bribing some of them to side with him. But fate was on her side. A few weeks later, government surveyors arrived in the village asking for the registered landowner. Everyone gathered to watch. Uncle Izu proudly waved his fake papers, boasting that the land was his. Nkemdalai stepped forward quietly, holding only her father's envelope. The officials examined both documents, checking every detail. The crowd waited in silence until one of the men finally said, "According to national records, the rightful owner is Miss Nkemdalai Okafor." Shock filled the air. Uncle Izu's pride melted into shame as the officials added that the land was also approved for an agricultural development grant. Months later, the same land became a thriving training center for village women. Nkemdalai smiled, knowing her father's dream had come true, proving that strength and legacy don't depend on gender, but on courage and heart. Her father's younger brother, Uncle Izu, was known in the village for his greed and arrogance. When Nkemdalai's father passed away, he wasted no time taking over the farmland. He acted as if it had always belonged to him, walking around the property giving orders to the workers and changing everything her father had built. When Nkemdalai confronted him, he laughed bitterly and said, "You are just a woman with no right here." The words stung like fire, but she refused to walk away. She reminded him that her father had always said the land would stay in the family, but Uncle Izu only smirked and replied that in their culture, women had no place in inheritance. The villagers whispered among themselves, most of them afraid to challenge him. Some pitied Nkemdalai, but no one dared to stand beside her. Every morning, Nkemdalai would pass by the farmland and watch him give commands as if her father's memory meant nothing. She felt her heart ache as she saw the crops being wasted under his careless hands. The workers who once respected her father now obeyed Izu out of fear. Even the elders pretended not to notice the injustice. Still, she stayed calm, believing that the truth would one day come to light. She started visiting her father's old house more often, searching through his belongings for something that could prove her right. Her nights were sleepless, her eyes swollen from tears, but her spirit never broke. One afternoon, when she tried to enter the farmland, Uncle Izu stopped her at the gate. "You can't step on this land again," he shouted before everyone, trying to humiliate her. People gathered to watch as he insulted her, saying a woman could never manage land. Nkemdalai looked at him without fear and said softly, "You may think I am nothing, but truth doesn't hide forever." Her words made him angry, but deep down he saw the same fire her father once had. Though hurt, Nkemdalai promised herself she wouldn't give up. She knew her father's love for her went beyond traditions, and she believed something would soon reveal the truth. Uncle Izu may have held the land for now, but she held her father's spirit, and that was more powerful than any paper or lie he could show. At the family meeting, Nkemdalai sat quietly in the corner while everyone talked over her. The gathering was meant to settle who owned her late father's farmland, but it quickly turned into a stage for mockery. Her uncle, Izu, stood up with confidence and told everyone that women had no right to land. The elders nodded in agreement, and some even laughed, calling Nkemdalai stubborn for trying to fight against tradition. One of her cousins smirked and said, A woman's place is in the kitchen, not on a farm. The room filled with cruel laughter, and Nkemdalai felt her chest tighten. Her hands trembled, but she refused to cry. She stood up and tried to speak, saying the land was her father's wish for her, but no one wanted to listen. Her aunt whispered loudly that she was bringing shame to the family. The more she tried to explain, the more they silenced her. One elder banged his walking stick and shouted that her words were an insult to their culture. Her uncle then pointed at her and said, "You are a disgrace, thinking you can challenge men." The crowd clapped in agreement, and the humiliation was complete. Nkemdalai could feel their eyes on her, filled with judgment and mockery. But inside her heart, something began to burn. A quiet anger mixed with strength. She looked around the room, remembering her father's voice telling her to never bow to injustice. When the meeting ended, she walked out slowly, her head held high even as people whispered behind her. Outside, she stood under the same tree where her father once told her stories about hard work and honesty. Tears finally rolled down her cheeks, but they weren't tears of weakness. They were of determination. She knew she had lost the room that day, but not the battle. She told herself that truth didn't need applause, it only needed proof. As the sun set that evening, she made a silent promise to her father's memory. She would fight, not just for the land, but for every woman who had been silenced by tradition. They laughed at her now, but one day, those same voices would speak her name with respect. She walked home with a firm heart, ready to uncover whatever her father had left for her, because humiliation could not kill her courage. While cleaning her late father's study, Nkemdalai moved slowly, touching the books, papers, and old photographs that still carried his scent. Dust covered everything, but the room felt alive with his memory. She had spent hours wiping the wooden shelves and rearranging his files when something caught her eye. A sealed brown envelope hidden beneath a pile of old newspapers. Her heart skipped a beat as she saw her father's familiar handwriting across it, along with an official government stamp. Her fingers shook as she picked it up. She sat on his old chair, tears welling in her eyes, and whispered, "Papa, what did you leave for me?" Carefully, she broke the seal and pulled out a set of papers that looked important. As she read through them, her breath caught. It was a government-issued land ownership document. The farmland was registered in her name. Her father had secretly transferred it before his death. Every line carried his love and faith in her. He had signed it himself, making sure no one could take away what belonged to her. Nkemdalai's tears fell on the paper, but this time they were tears of gratitude. She realized her father had known how greedy his brother was, and he had protected her long before he passed. Holding the document close to her chest, Nkemdalai felt her strength return. The humiliation she faced at the family meeting replayed in her mind, but now she had something stronger than words, proof. She wanted to run out and show everyone, but she stopped herself. She knew she had to be patient, to wait for the right moment. She carefully placed the document in a new envelope and hid it inside her clothes trunk. That night she couldn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking of her father's wisdom. "Courage doesn't shout," he used to say. "It speaks through truth." For the first time in weeks she smiled. The weight of shame and rejection lifted off her shoulders. The world might see her as just a woman, but her father saw her as his true heir. She promised herself that she would protect his legacy no matter what. The hidden papers had not only given her proof of ownership, but had also given her back her confidence, her voice, and her reason to fight again. Uncle Isa knew that Nkemdalai had something strong on her side, and fear began to creep into his heart. To protect his lies, he started bribing the village elders with gifts, money, and promises. He whispered to them that he would share the farmland profits if they stood by him. Slowly, those who once respected Nkemdalai's father began to turn their backs. When she tried to speak, they ignored her. When she asked for a fair hearing, they dismissed her. The whole village began to see her as the troublemaker, not the victim. It broke her heart to realize how easily truth could be silenced by greed. She went from house to house, hoping someone would listen, but everyone acted afraid. Some elders avoided her eyes. Others said it was better not to fight family. Rumors spread that she had forged the papers, even though she hadn't shown them to anyone yet. Uncle Isa's lies traveled faster than she could defend herself. Every day she woke up with new insults waiting for her. People calling her stubborn, disrespectful, or cursed for challenging a man's authority. The humiliation was unbearable, but she refused to give up. She knew her father raised her to stand for what was right, not what was easy. One evening, Nkemdalai sat alone under the mango tree near her father's old house, holding the document close to her chest. The moonlight touched her face as she whispered, "Papa, they are against me, but I will not stop." She knew that the truth was like the sun. No matter how long it hid behind clouds, it would always rise again. Her faith became her strength. Instead of fighting with anger, she waited for the right moment to reveal everything. Uncle Izu, feeling victorious, started planning to sell part of the land to a buyer from another town. He thought he had already won. But fate was not on his side. The following week, Nkemdalai noticed men in government uniforms entering the village, asking questions about the farmland ownership. Her heart pounded as she watched from a distance. It was a sign that the time for truth had finally come, and no amount of bribes could stop what was written in her father's name. Weeks later, the quiet village morning was broken by the sound of a white government vehicle driving through the dusty road. People came out of their homes, curious to see who had arrived. Out stepped a team of government surveyors wearing bright vests and holding clipboards. They greeted the villagers politely and said they had come from the city to confirm ownership of a piece of land registered under the National Agricultural Development Project. Everyone started whispering and pointing toward the farmland, the same one that had caused so much conflict. The leader of the team raised his voice and asked, "Who is the registered landowner of this property?" The question spread through the air like fire. Uncle Izu, standing among the villagers, quickly stepped forward with confidence. "I am the owner," he said proudly. He held out his fake documents, already smiling as if he had won again. The elders nodded in support of him, exactly as he had planned. Nkemdalai stood a few feet away, watching everything quietly. Her heart was pounding, but she stayed calm. She knew this was the moment her father had prepared her for. The surveyors asked to see all legal papers concerning the land. Izu presented his file filled with false documents, full of stamps and fake signatures. For a moment, it looked convincing to everyone watching. Then one of the officials said they needed to compare those records with the national files. He opened his tablet and typed for a few seconds. The villagers leaned forward waiting. After a short pause, the official frowned and said, "This registration doesn't match our records." A silence fell over the crowd. The official then looked around and asked again, "Who else claims ownership?" That was when Nkemdalai took a deep breath and stepped forward. She didn't shout or cry. She just opened her small brown envelope and handed it over with steady hands. The officials examined it carefully. The villagers began murmuring as the officials compared both sets of documents. The tension was thick, and Uncle Iza's smile started to fade. The officials whispered to one another, nodding slowly as they looked at Nkemdalai's papers. Everyone could sense that something big was about to be revealed, something that would change the story completely and expose the truth her father had left behind. Uncle Iza stood proudly before the crowd, his chest lifted and his voice loud. He waved his papers in the air and said, "Here is the proof that I am the true owner of this land." The villagers clapped and nodded, some whispering that the fight was finally over. He turned to the government officials with a proud smile, handing them the fake documents he had carefully forged. The officials began checking the papers, while Uncle Iza kept talking, bragging about how he had managed the farmland since his brother's death. He looked at Nkemdalai with a mocking grin and said, "You see? You can't challenge me. This land belongs to men, not to weak women with childish dreams." The crowd laughed, some even pointing at her, making jokes about her courage. Nkemdalai stood quietly, holding her father's brown envelope close to her chest. Her heart was heavy, but her face was calm. The laughter around her grew louder, yet she didn't move. The officials turned to her and asked softly, "Do you have any papers to prove your claim?" She nodded and stepped forward, her step slow but steady. When she opened the envelope, everyone leaned forward to see what she was holding. It looked small compared to the big file in Uncle Iza's hands. Someone in the crowd shouted, "Is that all you have?" And laughter erupted again. But Nkemdalai didn't react. She simply handed the envelope to the officials. The officials took it carefully and began to examine it. They opened the seal, studied the stamps, and compared the signatures with the national database. The laughter began to fade as they whispered to one another. Uncle Iza's smile started to slip. He tried to look confident, but sweat rolled down his forehead. The tension in the air grew heavier by the second. The villagers who had been laughing suddenly fell silent. Even the elders leaned in, curious. Nkemdalai stood still, her eyes fixed on the officials. She didn't say a word. Her father's voice echoed in her heart, reminding her that truth never needed to shout. When the officials finally looked up, everyone could feel that something had shifted. The power that once belonged to Uncle Izu was slowly crumbling, and the truth her father left behind was finally ready to speak for itself. The crowd grew silent as the official stood under the hot sun, holding both sets of documents. He carefully opened them, his serious eyes moving back and forth as he compared the signatures, the seals, and the registration numbers. The only sound that could be heard was the wind blowing through the trees. Everyone watched anxiously, their faces filled with tension. Uncle Izu stood tall at first, his fake smile still frozen in place, but Nkemdalai could see the worry beginning to creep into his eyes. The official frowned slightly, then looked at his team. They whispered among themselves before the lead officer cleared his throat and turned toward the villagers. He raised his voice so that everyone could hear. According to national records, he said slowly, the legal owner of this land is Miss Nkemdalai Okafor. For a moment, silence filled the air. No one moved. Then gasps spread through the crowd like a wave. Uncle Izu's face turned pale, his hands trembling as the paper slipped from his fingers. The elders looked at one another in disbelief. The same people who had mocked Nkemdalai earlier now stood speechless. The official continued, explaining that her father had legally transferred ownership to her before his death, and all national files confirmed it. Nkemdalai's eyes filled with tears as she listened. It felt as if her father was standing beside her, protecting her once again. The officials then announced that the land had also been approved for a government agricultural grant under her name, meant to support women in farming. The villagers gasped again, realizing that the very land Izu tried to steal had been destined for something much greater. Uncle Izu tried to speak, but no words came out. His lies had finally collapsed in front of everyone. Nkemdalai stepped forward, thanking the officials in a calm voice. She didn't boast or mock anyone. Instead, she said softly, "This land belongs to my father's dream, and I will make sure it feeds this village." The villagers bowed their heads, ashamed of how they had treated her. That day, she earned not just her father's land but also her place of respect in their hearts. The truth had spoken, and the voice of justice was louder than any insult ever thrown at her. The villagers went completely silent. Not a single word was heard as the truth sank in. All eyes turned toward Nkemdalai, the young woman they had once mocked. Moments ago they had laughed at her. Now they could barely look at her without shame. The official continued speaking, his voice firm and clear, announcing that the farmland was now officially part of a government development program registered under Nkemdalai's name. It was not only her property, but also supported by a national grant to help women in agriculture. The crowd gasped again. Some women covered their mouths in shock, while the men exchanged uneasy glances. What they thought was a simple family dispute had become something far bigger. Uncle Izu's proud face lost all color. He stepped back slowly, his hands shaking. The officials ignored his desperate attempts to speak and held up his fake documents, declaring them invalid and illegal. The same elders he had bribed now stood frozen, unable to defend him. His lies had been exposed before the entire village. The humiliation was unbearable. People who once cheered for him now whispered, calling him greedy and heartless. Nkemdalai didn't say anything. She just stood quietly, tears filling her eyes, not from pain but from relief. For so long, she had carried her father's dream alone, and now the world could finally see the truth. The officials congratulated her and explained that the grant would help her start a modern farming project that could employ local women. The villagers turned toward her, their expressions softening. Some of the same women who had once avoided her stepped closer and smiled with pride. Even the men who once laughed bowed their heads slightly, realizing they had judged her unfairly. Uncle Izu lowered his head, unable to meet her eyes. His power was gone, replaced by shame. The crowd slowly began to cheer, not out of fear but out of respect. Nkemdalai raised her eyes to the sky and whispered a quiet thank you to her father. It was as if his spirit had guided every step that led her here. The shock that once filled the air began to turn into hope, and the village knew that a new chapter had just begun. one led by a woman who turned humiliation into victory. Months later, the same land that once caused so much pain was filled with life again. Green crops waved in the wind, new machines stood on the fields, and women worked with smiles on their faces. Nkemdalai had turned her father's farmland into a modern agricultural training center. Every corner of the land carried her father's memory, but now it also carried her strength. Women from nearby villages came to learn how to plant, harvest, and manage their own farms. The same villagers who had once doubted her now admired her. They called her Mama Courage, a name she wore with pride. She built classrooms with simple wooden chairs and solar lights, where women gathered to learn modern farming techniques. Laughter replaced gossip, and hope replaced fear. The center became a place of empowerment, giving every woman who entered the courage to dream beyond limits. Even the men who once mocked her now respected her deeply. Some came seeking her advice, and Nkemdalai, with kindness, always helped them. She never used her success for revenge. She used it to build a better future. Uncle Izu could no longer look at her without regret. He often passed by the center quietly, ashamed but also amazed. He had tried to destroy her, but she had used her pain to grow stronger. One afternoon he approached her, his voice shaking as he said, "You have done what I never could." She simply nodded, replying softly, because this land was never about ownership, it was about purpose. The government officials visited again, impressed by how fast the project had grown. They promised more support, and soon the center became one of the best in the region. Nkemdalai stood before the fields one evening, the sun setting behind her, painting the sky in gold. She whispered a quiet thank you to her father, knowing he would be proud. The same soil that once tested her strength now carried her victory. Her story spread far beyond the village, inspiring many women to rise and believe in themselves. Nkemdalai had proven that legacy is not given by gender but earned through courage, heart, and determination. Hi besties to hearts, thank you so much for watching till the end. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more inspiring stories. See you in the next one. Bye. Sheaf of Rice Sparkles.